The corporate parking garage at Wilson Industries fell silent as Daniel Harris stood motionless, his work boots planted on oil-stained concrete, while Margaret Wilson knelt before him in her $1,000 suit. 20 employees had stopped mid-departure, car keys frozen in their hands, witnessing what would become the most discussed moment in company history. Her voice carried across the concrete pillars with unexpected steadiness, despite the vulnerability bleeding through every word. "Will you give me a chance?" Daniel said nothing. The silence stretched into territory that made witnesses uncomfortable, that made some look away while others leaned forward. Sophie's face pressed against the passenger window of his battered sedan, her 6-year-old features bright with anticipation that hadn't yet learned disappointment. The moment hung there, suspended between possibility and catastrophe, between courage and consequences nobody in that garage could predict. Then everything rewound. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had arrived at Wilson Industries before sunrise like he did every Tuesday, his maintenance cart loaded with tools that represented 4 years of rebuilding a life that had shattered completely. The building rose 47 stories into Atlanta's skyline, all glass and steel ambition housing people whose problems he fixed without them noticing his existence. Elevators that carried executives between meetings, HVAC systems, keeping corner offices comfortable, plumbing and executive bathrooms. He moved through their world like air, essential but invisible, and he'd made peace with that arrangement because it kept Sophie fed and housed and oblivious to how close they'd come to losing everything. The third-floor mechanical room smelled like machine oil and old metal, familiar territory where Daniel spent most mornings running diagnostics on systems other technicians couldn't figure out. The building had been constructed in 1987 with equipment that predated modern standardization, which meant most repairs required someone willing to learn through trial and observation rather than relying on manuals that didn't exist. He'd taught himself through YouTube videos and manufacturer forums during the hours after Sophie fell asleep, studying HVAC certification materials at the kitchen table of their 2-bedroom apartment while keeping one ear tuned to her breathing in the next room. His phone showed 6:47 a.m. when the diagnostic program flagged Elevator 3 with a sensor malfunction. Not immediately dangerous, but the kind of issue that would escalate into a real problem if left unattended. Daniel grabbed his toolbox and headed for the elevator shaft access panel on the 12th floor, taking the stairs because riding an elevator he was about to service felt like tempting fate. Sophie wouldn't wake up for another hour at the daycare where he dropped her every morning at 7:30, where she stayed until he finished his second job doing weekend security at a warehouse across town. The 12th floor belonged to mid-level executives whose names he'd never learned, people who made in a month what took him 6 months to earn across both jobs. Their carpet was thicker than his living room rug. Their coffee machine cost more than his monthly rent. He moved past empty cubicles toward the maintenance access panel, his presence at this hour ghost-like, unseen by anyone who mattered. The elevator alarm sounded at 8:47 a.m., the emergency bell that indicated someone was trapped inside. Daniel had just finished adjusting the problematic sensor when the sound cut through the floor's morning quiet, sending him sprinting toward the control panel. The display showed Elevator 3 stopped between floors 15 and 16 with one occupant inside. His radio crackled as building security confirmed the situation, their voice carrying the edge of panic that came from knowing the person trapped was Margaret Wilson, the CEO, whose approval ratings with the board were already under scrutiny. Daniel keyed his radio. "This is Harris from maintenance. I've got visual on the issue. Elevator 3, sensor failure caused emergency brake engagement. I can manually override and bring her down to 12, 5 minutes. He moved to the manual control panel while pulling up the intercom connection. "Ms. Wilson, this is Daniel from maintenance. I can see you're stuck between 12 and 13. I'm going to manually override the system and get you moving again. Should take about 5 minutes. Can you confirm you're not injured and the emergency brake is engaged?" Her voice came through the speaker thin and tight, stretched over something that sounded like barely controlled panic. "I'm fine, not injured, just—" "How long did you say?" 5 minutes, maybe less. I need you to breathe with me while I work. In for 4 counts, hold for 2, out for 6. Can you do that?" "Why?" Because panic makes your breathing shallow, and shallow breathing makes panic worse. It's a loop. We're going to break the loop. Ready? In, 2, 3, 4. He talked her through the breathing pattern while his hands moved across the manual override controls, bypassing the faulty sensor and engaging the backup descent protocol. The technical work required maybe 3 minutes of actual effort, but he stretched it to 6 by walking her through each step, his voice steady over the intercom while explaining what sounds she'd hear and why. People trapped in small spaces needed distraction more than silence, needed to feel like someone was actively working rather than waiting, needed the human voice as much as the technical solution. The elevator lurched once before descending smoothly to the 12th floor. Daniel had the doors open before the car fully settled, one hand extended to help her step over the gap between elevator and floor. She was younger than he expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of exhaustion in her eyes that came from responsibilities that didn't stop when you left the office. Her suit probably cost 3 months of his salary, but she wore it like armor that was starting to show cracks. "You okay?" His hand stayed extended even after she stepped clear, a gesture that felt natural rather than presumptuous. "Yes, thank you." She looked at him properly then, maybe the first time anyone from the executive floor had made actual eye contact with him since he'd started working here. That was a sensor malfunction already logged for replacement. But next time you see that red error light flashing, probably best not to get in. Safety protocols exist for reasons. The gentle correction came without condescension, delivered more like advice from someone who genuinely cared whether she stayed safe rather than criticism of her judgment. She smiled, an expression that transformed her face from corporate mask into something approaching human. "I'll remember that." "Thank you, Mr. Harris." "Daniel Harris." "Just Daniel is fine." "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you talking me through that. The breathing thing actually helped." "Anytime, Ms. Wilson. Try to have a good rest of your day." He turned back toward the maintenance access panel before she could respond, before the moment could stretch into territory that made either of them uncomfortable. Behind him, he heard her heels clicking away across the expensive carpet, and he allowed himself exactly 5 seconds to acknowledge that her smile had hit differently than he'd expected, before pushing the observation into the category of things that didn't matter because they couldn't lead anywhere that made sense. That evening, after picking Sophie up from daycare and microwaving the chicken nuggets that represented dinner 3 nights a week, Daniel found himself thinking about the elevator incident in ways that felt dangerously close to wondering. Sophie chattered about her day while building a Lego tower at their kitchen table, her narrative jumping between a boy named Marcus, who'd shared his crackers, and her teacher's announcement about the upcoming science fair that would let students build projects from recycled materials. "I want to make a wind turbine, Daddy, like the ones we saw that time driving to Grandma's, the big white ones that spin." "That's a great idea, sweetheart. We can start gathering materials this weekend. Maybe use plastic bottles for the blades, wooden dowels for the tower. Can it make real electricity, like enough to light up a bulb? If we build it right, absolutely. You want to try that?" Sophie's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that made every double shift and skipped meal worth it, that reminded Daniel why he'd chosen presents over fighting when everything had fallen apart 4 years ago. She returned to her Legos while he washed dishes by hand because their apartment's dishwasher had broken 6 months ago, and replacing it ranked somewhere below new shoes for Sophie and slightly above his own dental work on the priority list. His phone buzzed with a text from the warehouse supervisor confirming his weekend security shifts, 12 hours Saturday and Sunday at $15 an hour that would cover next month's daycare deposit. The math was simple and unforgiving. Maintenance technician at Wilson Industries paid $43,000 annually. Weekend security added another $15,000. Daycare cost $14,000. Rent cost $18,000. Everything else, food and utilities and Sophie's clothes and the slowly diminishing debt from Angela's final year, had to fit into what remained. Angela's photo watched from the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a butterfly that Sophie had picked out 2 years ago. She'd been a nurse at Grady Memorial, the kind of person who remembered patients' names and advocated for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. Ovarian cancer had taken her across 13 months that had consumed their savings, and Daniel's engineering career, and any belief that hard work guaranteed fair outcomes. By the end, he'd been making choices between lawyer fees to fight his wrongful termination and experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, and the choice hadn't really been a choice at all. "Daddy, you're doing the sad face again?" Sophie's observation pulled him back to the present, to the kitchen where she needed him focused rather than dwelling in a past he couldn't change. He smiled for her, the expression genuine even if it required effort to produce. "Just thinking about your wind turbine project, baby? You're going to blow everyone away at that science fair. Will you help me build it?" "Every step. We're a team, remember?" She grinned, gap-toothed and trusting, and returned to her Legos while Daniel finished the dishes and mentally catalogued which materials they could scavenge versus which would require actual purchase. The science fair was 6 weeks away, which meant they had time to build something impressive if he could carve out hours that currently didn't exist in his schedule. But Sophie asked for so little, adapted to their circumstances with resilience that simultaneously impressed and broke his heart, that saying no to her project felt impossible, even when saying yes meant sacrificing the sleep he barely got enough of already. The next morning, Wednesday, Daniel arrived at Wilson Industries to find a maintenance request for Margaret Wilson's office thermostat. According to the ticket, her office temperature was fluctuating erratically despite the system reporting normal function. He grabbed his diagnostic equipment and headed up to the 47th floor, to the executive territory where even the elevator doors opened differently, quieter and smoother than the ones serving lower floors. Her assistant waved him through without looking up from her computer. "Ms. Wilson is expecting you. Just knock." The CEO's office occupied the building's northeast corner with windows on 2 walls offering views that probably cost more in annual rent than Daniel earned. Margaret Wilson stood at one window with her back to the door, phone pressed to her ear while her voice carried the kind of forced patience that suggested this conversation wasn't going well. He knocked softly and waited. She turned, waved him in while continuing her phone conversation. "I understand the concern, Victor, but our quarterly projections speak for themselves. Revenue is up 18% year over year. Employee satisfaction scores are at record highs. I'm not interested in having this conversation again." She ended the call without waiting for response and turned to Daniel with an expression that took 3 seconds to shift from corporate mask to something approaching genuine. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming up. The temperature in here has been impossible lately. Freezing in the morning, sauna by afternoon." Daniel moved to the thermostat panel, already noticing that the unit was displaying normal readings that didn't match her description. "Let me run some diagnostics. Usually when you get wild fluctuations like that, it's either a failing temperature sensor or an issue with the zone control valve." He pulled the panel cover and started checking connections while she returned to her desk, the click of her keyboard providing ambient sound while he worked. The sensor tested fine. The valve tested fine. The thermostat was communicating properly with the building management system, which meant either the problem was intermittent in ways that wouldn't show up during testing, or there wasn't actually a problem, and this maintenance request had been generated for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature control. "Everything's testing normal, Ms. Wilson. Sensors accurate, valves responding correctly, communication with the main system is clean. If you're still getting temperature swings, it might be something in the main air handler for this zone, but that would affect other offices too. Anyone else on this floor reporting issues?" She looked up from her computer, and he caught something in her expression that confirmed his suspicion that this call had been about something other than HVAC problems. "Not that I've heard. Maybe I'm just more sensitive to it than others. Could be. Or could be that corner offices get more sun exposure, which makes the system work harder to compensate. Might help to close the blinds during peak afternoon hours if the temperature spikes are bothering you. I'll try that. Thank you for checking." He should have left then, should have packed his tools and returned to the mechanical room where actual work waited. Instead, he heard himself asking a question that wasn't his business. "That call earlier. Everything okay?" She laughed, a sound without much humor in it. "Board member who thinks I'm too young to run this company. He makes sure I know it at least once a week." "Are you?" "Am I what?" "Too young to run the company." Her eyebrows rose at the directness of the question, at someone from maintenance asking her something that probably qualified as inappropriate by any corporate standard. I'm 37. I've been with Wilson Industries for 12 years, worked in every major division, earned my MBA while serving as VP of Operations. My father built this company, but he chose me to lead it because I was the most qualified person for the job, not because I share his DNA. So, no, I'm not too young. Some people just don't like that the most qualified person turned out to be a woman who hasn't hit 40 yet. Then I'd say that's their problem, not yours. Your quarterly numbers back up your competence. People who can't see that are usually people who feel threatened by competence they don't possess. The observation came out more blunt than he'd intended, crossing boundaries that shouldn't exist between CEO and maintenance worker. But something about her expression during that phone call had reminded him of his own experiences with people who questioned credentials because they didn't match expectations, who assumed incompetence based on factors that had nothing to do with actual ability. She studied him with new attention, like she was seeing something beyond the uniform. That's a remarkably insightful perspective for someone who fixes air conditioners. I read a lot, and I've had some experience with people who confused circumstance with capability. The moment hung there, charged with something Daniel couldn't quite name and didn't want to examine too closely. He packed his tools deliberately, giving her time to return to work or end this conversation that was already lasting longer than professional distance recommended. Instead, she asked, "Do you have children, Daniel?" "One daughter. Sophie. She's 6. The warmth in his voice when saying Sophie's name must have registered because Margaret smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes. "What's she like?" "Smart. Curious. Building a wind turbine for her school science fair out of recycled materials. She asked yesterday if it could generate enough electricity to light a bulb, and when I said yes if we build it right, she spent an hour drawing designs that show better spatial reasoning than most adults manage. You sound proud. Every single day. Being her dad is the best thing I've ever done." The statement came automatically, worn smooth from repetition, not because it wasn't true, but because it was the truest thing he knew. Margaret's expression shifted into something softer, almost wistful, like she was witnessing something she recognized the value of, but had never experienced personally. "That's wonderful. She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, actually. Those moments when she needs me and I can be there for her, that's what life's supposed to be about." The philosophy emerged without planning, the kind of truth that lived so close to the surface it spilled out when given the slightest opening. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes holding his with intensity that made his pulse kick unexpectedly. "I think you might be right about that, though I admit it's a perspective I've struggled to internalize. I've spent most of my adult life measuring success by metrics that don't include presence or connection. It's never too late to change your metrics." The response was presumptuous, definitely overstepping boundaries between CEO and employee, but she didn't seem offended. Instead, she leaned back in her chair with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering something fundamental. Maybe not. "Thank you, Daniel, for fixing the thermostat, and for the conversation." "Any time, Ms. Wilson. Though between you and me, that thermostat was working just fine. Might want to check if someone's been adjusting the main settings randomly." He delivered the observation with a slight smile, letting her know he'd figured out the maintenance call had been manufactured, while simultaneously giving her an out if she wanted to pretend otherwise. She returned the smile with one that acknowledged the game without confirming it. "I'll look into that. Have a good day, Daniel." He left before the moment could extend further, before either of them could say something that crossed lines they couldn't uncross. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, his mind replaying the conversation and recognizing patterns he'd be wiser to ignore. The CEO of Wilson Industries had created a fake maintenance request to see him. That fact landed somewhere between flattering and terrifying, in territory he had no business exploring. That evening, after Sophie fell asleep with her wind turbine sketches scattered across her comforter, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Angela's photo in his hands. The image showed her at Sophie's second birthday party, chocolate cake smeared across her smile, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that made the photo hurt to look at and impossible to put away. She'd made him promise, in those final weeks when the cancer had stolen everything except her fierce love for their daughter, that he would find love again, that he wouldn't let grief define him, that Sophie deserved to see her father choose happiness even when happiness felt impossible. But finding love again required believing he had something to offer beyond steady employment and adequate parenting, required imagining someone might want to build a life with a 35-year-old maintenance worker whose biggest achievement was keeping his daughter fed and mostly happy. The engineering career he'd lost 4 years ago might have made him someone worth considering, someone whose education and potential matched ambition. But that person no longer existed in any meaningful sense, and pretending otherwise felt like lying about fundamental things. His phone buzzed with an email notification, probably the warehouse confirming next weekend's schedule or Sophie's daycare with some update about early dismissal next week. He almost ignored it before the sender name registered. Margaret Wilson. Subject line, Science Fair question. The message was brief and carefully professional. Daniel, Sophie's wind turbine project sounds fascinating. I've been thinking about ways Wilson Industries could support local STEM education, and I wondered if you'd be willing to discuss having Sophie's class visit our research and development facility to see industrial-scale renewable energy projects. It might provide inspiration for her science fair work. Let me know if that interests you. Best, Margaret Wilson. He read it 3 times, parsing the message for subtext while recognizing that offering his daughter's class an educational opportunity represented either genuine interest in STEM education or the most elaborately thoughtful way of creating another excuse for contact he'd ever encountered. Probably both. Definitely both. Which meant responding required navigating territory he'd spent 4 years avoiding. His reply took 20 minutes to compose. Ms. Wilson, that's incredibly generous. Sophie would be thrilled, and I'm sure her class would benefit enormously from seeing real-world applications of the concepts they're learning. I'd love to discuss the details whenever it's convenient for you. Please let me know what works with your schedule. Thank you for thinking of this. Daniel Harris. Professional, appropriate, giving her room to either follow through on the educational opportunity or let the idea fade if it had been offered as polite gesture rather than genuine intention. He hit send before he could second-guess the decision, then immediately second-guessed the decision anyway, then forced himself to close his laptop and focus on packing Sophie's lunch for tomorrow because dwelling on possibilities that probably wouldn't materialize was how you drove yourself crazy. Friday morning brought another maintenance request, this time for flickering lights in the executive conference room. Daniel arrived to find the lights functioning perfectly, no flicker or fluctuation, which confirmed his growing suspicion that Margaret Wilson was creating problems that didn't exist as excuse for his presence. The realization should have triggered alarm bells about professional boundaries and power dynamics and the dozen ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Instead, it triggered something uncomfortably close to hope, the dangerous kind that made you believe in possibilities you'd trained yourself to stop imagining. She arrived 10 minutes into his diagnostic testing, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested she knew exactly what he'd concluded about the lights. Find anything? Systems operating normally. No voltage fluctuations, no loose connections, no issues with the dimmer controls. Whatever was causing the flicker, it's resolved now. Lucky timing then. I appreciate you checking. She moved to close the conference room door, an action that shifted the dynamic from professional maintenance call to something more deliberately private. The click of the latch felt significant. Daniel, I'm going to be direct because I'm tired of manufacturing problems with thermostats and light fixtures. I'd like to take you and Sophie to dinner. Somewhere casual, nothing fancy, just a chance to get to know you both outside of me creating fake maintenance emergencies. The confession landed with enough honesty to derail the deflection he'd been preparing. He set down his voltage tester and turned to face her fully, taking 3 seconds to organize thoughts that wanted to scatter in multiple directions. Ms. Wilson, I appreciate that, more than you probably realize. But I need you to understand something before this goes any further. I have dignity. I won't be anybody's experiment or curiosity or rebellion against whatever makes your life feel empty. If you're serious about getting to know me and Sophie, if this is real interest in building something genuine, then I'm interested. But if you're just lonely and I'm convenient, if this is about having someone safe to test the waters with before moving on to someone more appropriate, I'd rather you be honest now. Because I can handle rejection. What I can't handle is being used and discarded while my daughter gets attached to someone who was never planning to stay. The words emerged harder than he'd intended, carrying 4 years of rebuilding self-worth that had been systematically dismantled by people who'd confused his circumstances with his value. Margaret didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression open in ways he suspected didn't happen often. I'm serious, Daniel. I'm not looking for an experiment. I'm looking for something real with someone who reminds me what real looks like. You scare me precisely because you're not convenient or safe. You're someone who might actually matter, and mattering means risking hurt in ways I've spent 3 years avoiding. So yes, I'm serious. And yes, I understand the stakes include your daughter's attachment. I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't prepared to honor that responsibility. The directness matched his own, stripped of corporate polish or social maneuvering, delivered as plain truth between two people who'd both learned to protect themselves differently. Daniel felt something in his chest unlock, permission he hadn't realized he needed to consider possibilities he'd stopped letting himself want. Then, yes, Sophie and I would like to have dinner with you. She'll be excited. Fair warning, though, 6-year-olds don't come with volume control or social filters. She'll probably ask you 100 questions and tell you everything she knows about wind turbines within the first 15 minutes. Margaret laughed, genuine amusement brightening her face. That sounds perfect. Tomorrow evening? There's a pizza place near Sophie's school that has arcade games. Nothing fancy, but the food's good and Sophie can burn energy while we talk. Tomorrow works. Should I pick you up? No need. I'll meet you there. Text me the address. She handed him her business card with her personal cell number written on the back, the gesture both professional and intimate. He pocketed it while trying to ignore how his pulse had accelerated, how the conference room suddenly felt too small and too warm. I should finish checking these lights, even though we both know they're working fine. Probably wise. Maintain the illusion of professional boundaries for at least another 24 hours. She left with a smile that stayed with him through the rest of his shift, through picking up Sophie from daycare, through dinner and homework and bedtime routine. After Sophie fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with Angela's photo and had a conversation that existed only in his head but felt necessary anyway. I think I'm about to do something that scares me. Meeting someone who makes me remember what wanting feels like. Sophie likes her already, or she will once they meet properly. I know you'd tell me to go for it, to stop living like I died with you. But it's hard. Moving forward feels like leaving you behind, even though I know that's not how it works. I'm trying, Ang. I'm trying to honor what you asked me to do, even when it terrifies me. The photo offered no response except Angela's frozen smile, preserved in a moment before cancer and loss and the years of rebuilding that followed. But sitting there with her image, Daniel felt something close to permission, the sense that choosing to live fully wasn't betrayal, but exactly what she'd wanted for him. Saturday morning arrived with Sophie's questions about why Daddy was acting weird, why he kept checking his phone, why they were getting dressed up for pizza when pizza was usually a sweatpants meal. He deflected with partial truths about meeting someone nice, about making a good impression, about how sometimes pizza required actual pants instead of sweatpants. She accepted the explanations with 6-year-old pragmatism that didn't question the contradictions. The pizza place occupied a strip mall location between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, exactly the kind of aggressively normal venue that would attract zero attention. Margaret was already there when they arrived, sitting in a booth wearing jeans and a casual sweater that made her look younger and more approachable than her CEO armor allowed. Sophie spotted her first and announced at volume that carried across the entire restaurant, "Daddy, that's the pretty lady from the elevator." Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck. "Sophie, inside voice, please. But she is pretty, and she smells nice." Margaret laughed, sliding out of the booth to kneel at Sophie's level. "You must be Sophie. Your dad told me you're building a wind turbine. That's really impressive. I'm going to make it generate enough electricity to power a light bulb. Daddy says if we build it right, we can do that with recycled materials." "I believe it. I've seen your dad fix things other people said were impossible. If he says you can do it, you probably can." The easy warmth in her voice, The genuine interest in Sophie's project, rather than perfunctory adult acknowledgement, made something in Daniel's chest tighten. They slid into the booth, Sophie positioning herself strategically between them, and ordered pizza that arrived accompanied by Sophie's unfiltered narration about school and friends and the boy named Marcus, who had shared crackers, and her teacher, who sometimes wore 2 different earrings, which Sophie found fascinating. Margaret listened with attention that appeared authentic rather than performed, asking follow-up questions that showed actual engagement rather than polite tolerance. When the pizza was demolished and Sophie had extracted quarters for the arcade games, the adults were left with the breathing room for actual conversation. "She's wonderful, Daniel. You've done an incredible job with her. Had a lot of help from daycare providers and her teacher and other parents who were willing to cover gaps. Single parenting requires a village whether you want to admit needing one or not." "How long has it been?" "Since her mother..." 4 years. Ovarian cancer. Took her across 13 months that felt like 13 years and also like no time at all. By the end, we were making choices between treatments and legal fees, and treatment won every time, even when it meant letting other things go. Legal fees? I used to be a mechanical engineer, designed HVAC systems for commercial buildings. Lost my job 4 years ago under circumstances that involved stolen intellectual property and falsified safety reports. Had evidence to fight it, but Angela was dying and Sophie was too, and the choice between lawyer fees and being present for my family wasn't really a choice at all. The confession emerged easier than expected, maybe because she'd already demonstrated willingness to see him as person rather than position. Maybe because holding on to secrets that shaped everything felt exhausting. Margaret's expression shifted through surprise and anger, and something that looked like respect. "So you walked away from your career to be there for them." "I chose presence over vindication. Don't regret it, even though it cost me professionally. Sophie needed her dad more than I needed to be proven right. Angela needed me present, not consumed by legal battles I couldn't afford to win. Some choices aren't really choices even when they look like decisions." "That's remarkable, Daniel. Most people would have fought regardless of the cost. Most people haven't watched someone they love die while their 2-year-old daughter asks why mommy doesn't play anymore. Perspective changes when you're living it rather than theorizing about it." Sophie returned from the arcade with a purple plastic ring she'd won from a claw machine, presenting it to Margaret with ceremony that suggested this represented significant friendship offering. "This is for you because you're nice, and you made Daddy smile the real way, not the pretend way." Margaret accepted the ring like it was precious metal rather than carnival prize, sliding it onto her finger with solemnity that matched Sophie's presentation. "Thank you, Sophie. I'll treasure it. And I'm glad your dad is smiling the real way. He has a great smile." Sophie beamed and returned to the arcade, leaving the adults with the weight of a 6-year-old's observation about pretend smiles versus real ones. Daniel met Margaret's eyes across the table and found her watching him with expression that combined attraction and something deeper, something that looked like recognition. She's perceptive. Kids usually are. They haven't learned to ignore their instincts yet. They just see what's there without all the complicated filters adults develop. "What do you see, Daniel? When you look at me?" The question was intimate and direct, demanding honesty rather than flattery. He considered deflecting before deciding that if this was going to mean something, it required truth from the beginning. "I see someone who built impressive career while forgetting to build a life worth coming home to. Someone who measures success by metrics that leave her accomplished but lonely. Someone who's terrified that letting people in means giving them power to hurt you. And I see someone brave enough to kneel in a parking garage in front of her employees to ask out a maintenance worker, which suggests you're done living by other people's definitions of appropriate." Her eyes widened slightly before she smiled, this expression carrying none of the corporate polish or defensive humor that usually colored her interactions. "That's remarkably accurate for someone who's known me less than a week. I pay attention, and I've had experience with building walls that keep pain out but also keep everything good out with it. Takes one to know one, I guess." "Are you saying we're the same?" "I'm saying we've both learned to protect ourselves differently, and maybe it's time to try something else. You asked if I was serious about this earlier. I am, but I need you to know what that means." Sophie asks about her mom every night at bedtime. I tell her Angela would be proud of the person she's becoming. I'm not looking for someone to replace Angela or make Sophie forget her mother existed. I'm looking for someone who understands that second love doesn't erase first love. It honors it by proving love is worth the risk even after loss. If you can't handle that, if the ghost of my dead wife is too much baggage, then we should end this now before Sophie gets more attached. Margaret reached across the table, her hand finding his with certainty that suggested the decision had already been made. I can handle it, Daniel. In fact, I respect it. You're not trying to erase your past or pretend it didn't happen. You're integrating it into who you are now. That's healthy and honest and exactly the kind of emotional maturity I've been looking for without realizing it. Then we're doing this. Actually doing this, not just testing waters or seeing what happens. Because Sophie deserves better than watching adults play games with commitment. We're doing this. Actually, for real. They stayed until the arcade closed, until Sophie had burned through all the quarters and most of her energy, until the moment felt complete rather than cut short. Walking to their cars, Sophie took Margaret's hand without asking permission, chattering about tomorrow's plans and whether Margaret liked butterflies because the Natural History Museum had a butterfly exhibit that Sophie wanted to visit. I love butterflies, Margaret told her with sincerity that made Sophie grin. We should definitely go see them soon. In the parking lot, Sophie already buckled into the passenger seat of Daniel's sedan. Margaret lingered by his driver's door with expression that looked simultaneously nervous and determined. I had a really good time tonight, both with Sophie and with you. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for asking, and for being brave enough to risk this when you didn't have to. She kissed his cheek, quick and chaste but carrying promise of more complicated moments ahead. Then she walked to her car while Sophie shrieked with excitement through the closed window loud enough that other people in the parking lot turned to see what had caused such reaction. Daniel slid behind the wheel to find Sophie bouncing in her seat. "Daddy, you like her. Like really like her. Are you going to marry her? Can she be my new mom? Does this mean we're getting a bigger house?" "Slow down, sweetheart. We're just getting to know each other. It's way too early to talk about marriage or moving or any of that. Let's just see how it goes, okay? But you do like her. The real way, not the pretend way." "Yeah, baby, I do. The real way." Sophie settled into satisfied silence, hugging her stuffed elephant while Daniel started the car and tried to process what he'd just initiated. The drive home took 15 minutes through Atlanta traffic that was mercifully light for a Saturday evening, Sophie dozing off halfway through while Daniel's mind raced ahead to complications he couldn't predict and consequences he couldn't control. At home, carrying Sophie inside while she mumbled sleepy questions about whether Margaret liked strawberries because Sophie wanted to share her favorite fruit, Daniel felt the full weight of what moving forward would cost if this went wrong. Not just his own heartbreak, which he could survive, but Sophie's. She was already attached, already imagining Margaret as permanent fixture rather than tentative possibility. The responsibility of protecting her from that potential loss while simultaneously pursuing something genuine created tension that had no good resolution. After Sophie was asleep, her wind turbine sketches spread across her comforter like blueprints for futures she couldn't foresee. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his phone and pulled up employee records he technically shouldn't access, but could, because building maintenance had system privileges nobody thought to restrict. Margaret Wilson's address lived in a penthouse downtown, the kind of luxury high-rise with doormen and concierge service and monthly fees that exceeded his annual salary. Her official biography listed Harvard MBA, 12 years with Wilson Industries, board appointment at 35 after her father's retirement. The gulf between their worlds looked insurmountable in bullet points and square footage, in salary differentials and educational credentials. But then he remembered her smile when Sophie presented that plastic ring, the genuine warmth when listening to 6-year-old stories about crayon sharing and butterfly exhibits, the way she'd knelt in that booth to meet Sophie at eye level rather than talking down to her. Those moments didn't appear in official biographies or salary statements, but they mattered more than any credential. His phone buzzed with a text. "Margaret, thank you again for tonight. Sophie is absolutely delightful and you're pretty great yourself. Sleep well." He typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on, "Tonight was good. Really good. Sophie already wants to know when she'll see you again, which I'm taking as strong endorsement. Sleep well." Her response came immediately. "Tomorrow? I meant what I said about the butterfly exhibit. If you're free. Tomorrow works. Sophie will be thrilled, so will I." Daniel set his phone down and looked at Angela's photo on the refrigerator, held by that butterfly magnet Sophie had chosen. The universe had a strange sense of humor sometimes, bringing someone into his life who Sophie instinctively connected to through butterflies without knowing the significance. Maybe that was Angela's way of giving permission. Maybe it was random coincidence. Maybe it didn't matter which, because the result was the same regardless. Sunday morning brought Sophie's squeals when Daniel told her about butterfly plans, followed by an hour of selecting the perfect outfit while lecturing him about how first impressions mattered even with people you'd already met. They picked Margaret up from her building, Sophie chattering from the back seat about butterfly facts she'd memorized while Margaret smiled and asked follow-up questions that showed actual interest rather than polite tolerance. The Natural History Museum bustled with weekend crowds, families with strollers and school groups and elderly couples holding hands. They moved through the Butterfly Conservatory where Sophie darted between exhibits while Daniel and Margaret followed at slower pace, close enough to supervise but far enough to have adult conversation. "This feels normal," Margaret observed, watching Sophie examine a blue morpho butterfly through glass. "Like something I could get used to. It is normal. This is what Sundays look like for us. Museums or parks or library story time. Nothing fancy, just showing up and being present. I like it. I've spent so many years measuring worth by professional achievement that I forgot life happens in these spaces between accomplishments. You've reminded me of that. Angela used to say that success isn't what you achieve, it's who you become along the way and who you bring with you. I didn't understand that until after she was gone, until I realized I'd lost my career but kept myself and Sophie. Turned out keeping the important things was the real achievement." She took his hand, fingers interlacing with natural ease that suggested this was becoming familiar rather than tentative. "I think I'm starting to understand that. You're teaching me things I should have learned years ago." They spent 3 hours at the museum, Sophie collecting butterfly stickers and facts with equal enthusiasm until she finally ran out of energy and requested lunch at the museum cafe. Over sandwiches and fruit cups, Sophie announced to the nearby tables that Margaret was her daddy's girlfriend now, and they were probably getting married soon because Daddy smiled the real way. Daniel nearly choked on his sandwich while Margaret laughed. The woman at the next table smiled indulgently while her husband shot Daniel a sympathetic look that said, "Welcome to parenthood, where children announce your relationship status to strangers." After lunch, Margaret needed to return home to prepare for Monday meetings, but she knelt to Sophie's level before leaving. "Thank you for sharing your butterflies with me today. I had the best time. Will you come to my science fair? It's in 6 weeks and I'm building the wind turbine, and Daddy says it'll be the best one, but I want you to see it too." Margaret looked at Daniel, question in her eyes about whether that invitation was premature. He nodded slightly, giving permission while recognizing this represented Sophie claiming Margaret as permanent rather than temporary presence. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Margaret told Sophie. "I'll be there in the front row cheering the loudest." Sophie hugged her with 6-year-old enthusiasm that nearly knocked them both over, then skipped back to the car while Margaret stood and faced Daniel. "Your daughter just invited me to an event 6 weeks away. That feels significant." "It is. She doesn't extend invitations unless she expects people to keep them. Fair warning, she'll hold you to that promise. I intend to keep it. All of them." They kissed goodbye, longer this time and carrying more promise, while Sophie pretended not to watch from the car, but definitely watched. Driving home, Sophie declared this the best weekend ever and asked approximately 47 questions about when Margaret would visit their apartment and whether she liked macaroni and cheese and if she knew how to play checkers. "Soon, Sophie. She'll visit soon. And we'll find out what else she likes besides butterflies and pizza." That evening, after Sophie finally fell asleep clutching her new butterfly stickers, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and tried to reconcile the happiness threatening to take root with the hard-earned caution that had protected them for 4 years. Moving forward with Margaret meant risking the stability he'd built. meant gambling Sophie's emotional security on something that could end badly. But not moving forward meant teaching Sophie that fear should govern decisions, that protecting yourself from loss was worth sacrificing connection. He chose connection, chose the risk, chose the terrifying possibility that maybe life could be good again in ways that honored Angela's memory while building something new. Monday morning brought him back to Wilson Industries, back to maintenance rounds and repair tickets, and the comfortable anonymity of moving through spaces where nobody noticed his presence. Except now Margaret noticed. Now their paths crossed in ways that felt deliberately arranged, hallway conversations that lasted longer than necessary, maintenance requests that might be legitimate or might be excuses. The other employees noticed too, whispers starting in break rooms and elevator rides, speculation about the CEO's increased interest in the building's maintenance issues. By Wednesday, the gossip had reached Daniel's supervisor, who pulled him aside with expression that combined amusement and concern. "Harris, you need to be careful. People are talking about you and Ms. Wilson. I don't care what you do on your own time, but inside this building, we need to maintain professional boundaries." "Understood. We're being careful." "See that you are. I like you, Harris. You're the best technician we've had in years. But if this situation creates problems, you're the one who'll lose. Just keep that in mind." The warning was fair and accurate, and exactly what Daniel had been telling himself for days. The power differential meant if this ended badly, he'd be the expendable one, the maintenance worker who could be replaced without disrupting operations. Margaret would survive professionally regardless. He'd be the collateral damage. That evening, Margaret texted, "Can we talk? Something happened today." His stomach dropped. He called instead of texting back. "What's wrong?" "Board meeting this afternoon. Ronald Clark, one of the board members, made pointed comments about my judgment and decision-making. He didn't mention you specifically, but the implication was clear. People are talking, Daniel, about us, about whether my personal life is affecting my professional performance." "Is it?" "No. Our quarterly numbers are the best they've been in 5 years. Employee satisfaction is up. Every metric that matters shows improvement under my leadership, but perception matters in boardrooms. The whispers about me dating a maintenance worker are being used as evidence that I lack the gravitas or judgment to lead. What do you want to do?" "I want to tell them all to go to hell. But realistically, I need to be strategic. We need to be strategic, which might mean being more discreet for a while until I can prove this isn't affecting my work. Or it might mean ending this before it gets more complicated." The silence stretched long enough that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. Then Margaret's voice came through tight with emotion. "Is that what you want?" "No. But I'm trying to give you an out if you need one. I won't be the reason your career gets derailed, Margaret. You've worked too hard to have everything questioned because you're dating someone the board considers beneath you. You're not beneath anyone, Daniel. Don't ever say that or think that. I'm pragmatic about power dynamics. If this becomes a problem for you professionally, I'll step back. Sophie and I will survive. We've survived worse. I don't want you to step back. I want to figure out how to do this without letting other people's limited imagination dictate my choices. But I also need to acknowledge that your job is more vulnerable than mine. If Ronald decides to make an issue of this, you could lose your position here. That's not fair, but it's reality. Then we're careful. Professional in the building. Keep our personal life separate until the gossip dies down, or you've proven whatever point you need to prove to the board. Are you sure? That's asking a lot of you. I'm sure. Sophie and I aren't going anywhere. We can be patient. Thank you. For understanding. For being willing to navigate this with me instead of just walking away because it got complicated. That's what partners do, Margaret. They figure out hard things together. The word partners hung between them, heavier than boyfriend or girlfriend, implying commitment neither had explicitly articulated but both seemed to accept. After they ended the call, Daniel sat with that weight, recognizing he'd just promised something significant to someone he'd known less than 3 weeks. But sometimes you just knew. Sometimes the right person arrived, and all the careful caution dissolved into certainty that couldn't be explained or defended, only experienced. Friday afternoon, leaving work after his shift ended, Daniel found Kevin Allen from IT waiting by his car. The encounter felt deliberate rather than coincidental, Kevin's expression carrying something that looked like warning. Harris, word of advice. Be careful with Ms. Wilson. Some people on the board don't like where that relationship is heading. Appreciate the concern, but my personal life is personal, not when it affects the CEO's position. Ronald Clark is looking for ammunition to use against her. Your relationship gives him exactly what he needs. Might want to think about that before things get more serious. The message delivered, Kevin walked away before Daniel could respond, leaving him standing in the parking garage with understanding crystallizing into something close to anger. The board wasn't just gossiping, they were strategizing, and he'd just become a weapon someone wanted to use against Margaret. That evening, having Sophie stay overnight with his neighbors so he could have uninterrupted conversation with Margaret, Daniel drove to her building and talked his way past the doorman who clearly recognized him from previous visits. She answered her penthouse door wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, her CEO armor completely absent, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd seen. Kevin Allen approached me today. Suggested I should think carefully about our relationship because it's giving Ronald ammunition against you. Margaret's expression hardened. Ronald is using you to undermine me. I'm sorry, Daniel. I never wanted you caught in corporate politics. Don't apologize. I chose this knowing the risks. But we need to talk strategy. If Ronald's building a case against you, what does that look like? What's his end game? Vote of no confidence. If he can convince enough board members that I lack judgment or that my personal life creates liability for the company, he can force a vote that would remove me as CEO. Can he win that vote? Currently, no. I have majority support. But if he manufactures enough concern, if he positions your relationship as evidence of instability or poor decision-making, he might sway enough people to make it close. And even if he loses, the damage to my authority would be significant. So we're giving him exactly what he needs by continuing this relationship. You're not giving him anything. He's weaponizing normal human behavior because he wants my position and couldn't earn it through competence. Daniel moved to stand in front of her, taking her hands while meeting her eyes with intensity that allowed no misunderstanding. Listen to me carefully. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built. If stepping back protects you professionally, I'll do it. Sophie and I will still be here when the board situation resolves. We can wait. I don't want to wait. I don't want to let Ronald's jealousy and manipulation determine how I live my life. Then we fight. Together. But we fight smart, not reckless. Which means we're careful in public, professional at work, and we document everything. If Ronald tries to make our relationship an issue, we need evidence that it's not affecting your performance. Metrics, timelines, proof that your leadership is stronger now than before we met. You've thought about this. I've had experience with people weaponizing circumstances to destroy careers. I learned from it. This time, we're prepared. They strategized until past midnight, building defense before attack arrived, preparing for battles that hadn't started yet but would. When Daniel finally left, driving home through empty Atlanta streets, he felt the weight of what they'd chosen. Not the easy path, not the safe option, but the right thing, done the hard way, together. Saturday morning, reunited with Sophie, who asked 17 questions about why Daddy had stayed out so late, Daniel took her to the hardware store to gather materials for the wind turbine project. They spent the afternoon in their apartment's parking lot assembling plastic bottles and wooden dowels and copper wire according to designs Sophie had refined through multiple iterations. Other residents came out to watch, offering suggestions and encouragement, the kind of community support that made their modest apartment complex feel more like home than Margaret's luxury penthouse probably ever would. By evening they had a working prototype, the small LED bulb lighting when Sophie spun the blades with her hand. Her shriek of excitement attracted half the building, neighbors applauding while Sophie demonstrated her creation with pride that made Daniel's chest ache with love so fierce it almost hurt. This is what matters, he thought, watching Sophie explain wind turbine mechanics to their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, not corner offices or board politics or impressive credentials. This, being present for moments that build a childhood worth remembering. His phone buzzed. Margaret. How's the wind turbine coming? He sent a video of Sophie demonstrating the light-up feature, her narration enthusiastic and technical simultaneously. Margaret's response came within seconds. That's incredible. She's going to win that science fair. Can I take you both to celebrate tomorrow? My treat. Daniel hesitated, remembering their agreement about discretion, before realizing that hiding their relationship from Sophie sent the wrong message entirely. Yes, Sophie would love that. So would I. Sunday brunch became tradition over the following weeks, their relationship finding rhythm that balanced caution at work with authenticity everywhere else. They navigated the scrutiny carefully, maintaining professional distance in Wilson Industries while building something genuine in the spaces between. Sophie absorbed Margaret into their small family with enthusiasm that sometimes terrified Daniel. Her questions about when Margaret would move in and whether they'd get a bigger house, and if she could call her mom, all coming faster than the relationship had actually progressed. The board meeting where everything shifted happened 3 weeks after that first parking lot confession. Daniel knew about it because Margaret warned him the night before, her voice tight with tension that bled through the phone connection. Ronald's making his move tomorrow. Emergency board meeting to discuss concerns about my leadership. He'll bring up our relationship. He'll try to position it as evidence of poor judgment. What do you need from me? Just know that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not ashamed of us. I won't lie or pretend you don't matter. If he forces me to choose between you and this job, I choose you. Margaret, don't do that. Don't throw away everything you've built because Ronald's a jealous ass. It's not throwing away if I'm choosing something more valuable. You've taught me that professional success means nothing if you're empty inside. I'd rather have you and Sophie and actual happiness than this job and continued loneliness. The conviction in her voice terrified and amazed him simultaneously, the recognition that she meant it completely, that she'd actually walk away from the CEO position to protect what they were building together. It made him love her and want to protect her from that choice in equal measure. The next evening, waiting for Margaret to call after the board meeting, Daniel distracted himself by helping Sophie refine her science fair presentation. The wind turbine had evolved through multiple prototypes into something genuinely impressive, capable of generating enough electricity to power 3 LED bulbs simultaneously. Sophie had documented the process with photos and notes that showed scientific method beyond her grade level, had prepared a presentation that explained renewable energy concepts with clarity that would impress adults. She'll win, Daniel told himself while watching Sophie practice her speech to her stuffed elephant audience. She'll win regardless of what happens with Margaret's board meeting, regardless of whether Ronald succeeds in destroying what we've built. Sophie will win because she's brilliant and hardworking and everything good about life. His phone rang at 8:47 p.m., Margaret's voice when he answered carrying exhaustion and something that might have been triumph. It's done. Ronald made his accusations, brought up our relationship, questioned my judgment, suggested I was having some kind of breakdown that made me unfit to lead. The board voted. Daniel's heart stopped. And 14-3 in my favor, with requirement that Ronald cease using my personal life as ammunition or face removal himself. The chairman made clear that my performance speaks for itself, that my relationships are my business unless they actually affect company operations, and that Ronald's obsession with undermining me was more concerning than anything I'd actually done. So you won. We won, Daniel. We survived the first real test, and I want to celebrate. I want to take you and Sophie somewhere special. I want to stop hiding and be public about the fact that you matter to me. Unless you think that's premature. Daniel laughed, relief and joy mixing into something that felt dangerously close to love if it wasn't already there. I think Sophie's been telling strangers we're getting married since the second date. Going public probably won't surprise anyone who knows us. Then it's settled, tomorrow evening, somewhere nice where Sophie can wear that dress she keeps talking about, and I can introduce you both as the people who make my life worth living. After they hung up, Daniel stood in the middle of his living room and let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. They'd won. Not just the board vote, but permission to stop being careful, to stop treating their relationship like something shameful that required hiding. He'd been braced for loss, prepared for the moment when circumstances forced impossible choices. Instead, they'd found a way through, together. Sophie appeared in her doorway, sleepy and confused about why Daddy was standing alone in the living room. "Everything okay, Daddy?" "Everything's good, sweetheart. Really good. Margaret wants to take us somewhere special tomorrow to celebrate. Think you're up for that? Can I wear my butterfly dress?" "Absolutely." She shuffled back to bed, satisfied, while Daniel returned to the kitchen table where Angela's photo maintained its vigil. The past 3 weeks had proven something he'd been afraid to believe, that moving forward didn't require abandoning what came before, that new love could honor old love, that happiness wasn't betrayal of grief, but evolution through it. The parking garage moment that would become company legend happened Friday evening at 5:45 p.m., carefully timed for maximum witness presence while remaining after official business hours. Margaret had planned it meticulously, had asked Daniel to meet her by his car, had ensured Sophie was present, and several key employees were conveniently nearby. She found him loading his tools while Sophie waited in the passenger seat, her butterfly dress visible through the window. The employees who'd stopped to watch, some deliberately invited and others genuinely coincidental, formed an audience that made Daniel's pulse spike with recognition that something significant was happening. Margaret walked toward him with purpose that suggested this moment had been choreographed, stopping close enough that her words would carry to witnesses, but maintaining distance that kept the moment from feeling theatrical. "Daniel, I need to ask you something." The entire garage went silent. Even the traffic noise from the street seemed to quiet, creating space for whatever came next. "I've spent 3 years convincing myself that being alone was safer than being vulnerable. That professional success could substitute for human connection. That protecting myself from potential hurt was worth the guaranteed loneliness. Then I got stuck in an elevator and met someone who reminded me what actually matters. Someone who's teaching me to measure success by different metrics. Someone whose daughter gives me plastic rings and considers them precious." She paused, the moment extending into territory that made witnesses lean forward. Daniel stood frozen, understanding blooming across his features as he recognized what she was doing. "I know the last 3 weeks have been complicated. I know my board and your job and public opinion have all created pressure that shouldn't exist between two people just trying to figure out if they belong together, but I'm done letting other people's opinions determine how I live. I'm done hiding something good because it doesn't match someone else's expectations." She knelt then, the gesture shocking in its reversal of traditional dynamics, the CEO on her knees in front of the maintenance worker, while 24 employees watched with phones raised to document the moment. "I don't deserve you," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the concrete despite not being raised. "You're a better parent, a more genuine person, someone with clearer understanding of what makes life valuable. But I'm asking anyway, will you give me a chance? Will you let me build something real with you and Sophie? Will you risk this with me, even though it means navigating complicated circumstances and public scrutiny and all the ways this could go wrong?" Daniel stood there, Sophie's face pressed against the car window behind him, 20 witnesses waiting for his response. The moment demanded words equal to the gesture, required matching her vulnerability with his own. He knelt too, bringing them to equal level, taking her hands while meeting her eyes with expression that conveyed everything before words arrived. "Ms. Wilson, Margaret, I've been giving you a chance since the moment you asked, since you manufactured that first thermostat emergency because you wanted excuse to see me, since you met Sophie and treated her like she mattered instead of tolerating her as obligation. Since you proved that successful people can choose genuine connection over safe distance." Sophie shouted through the closed window loud enough that everyone heard. "Daddy, say yes! Tell her yes!" The witnesses laughed, tension breaking into something approaching joy. Daniel squeezed Margaret's hands, smile breaking across his face. "Yes, for Sophie, and for me, and for whatever we build together, yes." They stood together, the parking garage erupting in applause from employees who'd just witnessed their CEO kneel in her designer suit to ask out a man in work boots. Sophie burst from the car to crash into both of them, her enthusiasm nearly knocking them over, her 6-year-old voice announcing to everyone present that this was the best day ever and they were definitely getting married now. Margaret laughed while Sophie clung to her, while witnesses captured video that would circulate through the company by Monday morning, while Daniel stood there feeling like maybe life had decided to work out after all. The moment crystallized into memory that would define everything that followed, the CEO and the maintenance worker choosing each other publicly despite every reasonable objection, despite power differentials and professional boundaries and social expectations that said their relationship couldn't work. They chose it anyway. They chose each other. They chose the risk. And standing there in that parking garage with Sophie between them and witnesses documenting the moment and Atlanta traffic humming in the background, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since before Angela's diagnosis. He felt hope, not the careful, guarded kind that protected against disappointment, but the reckless, believing kind that expected good things and welcomed them without qualification, the kind of hope that made futures possible. The pizza place became their refuge over the following week, neutral territory where neither corporate politics nor maintenance schedules could intrude. Saturday evening found them in the same booth where they'd shared their first meal, Sophie absorbed in arcade games while Daniel and Margaret navigated the peculiar intimacy of planning a future when the present remained unstable. Margaret pushed a French fry around her plate without eating it. "I've been thinking about what happens next. Logistically, you and Sophie living in that apartment while I'm across town in the penthouse doesn't make sense long term." Daniel's hand stilled around his water glass. "We've been together 3 weeks, Margaret. Moving in together is jumping ahead several chapters. I'm not suggesting we move in tomorrow. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that this is heading somewhere permanent and start planning accordingly instead of pretending we're still figuring out if this is real." The directness was characteristic, her corporate efficiency bleeding into personal territory where most people moved more cautiously. Daniel appreciated the honesty even while recognizing the complications it exposed. Sophie's attachment accelerated everything, her questions about when Margaret would be her official mom arriving daily, with the persistence of someone who'd already decided the outcome and was just waiting for adults to catch up. "What does planning look like to you?" His voice carried caution earned through years of watching stability collapse without warning. "Finding somewhere that works for all three of us. Not my place or your place, but our place. Somewhere Sophie can have a yard and you can have space for projects, and I can have the home office I've never needed because I've always just stayed at work. You're talking about buying a house together." "Eventually, yes. But first I'm talking about you letting me contribute financially in ways that make sense. You work 2 jobs because one doesn't cover your costs. That's not sustainable, Daniel. And before you tell me you won't take my money because of pride or dignity or whatever else, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. Partners share burdens." His jaw tightened, the familiar tension arriving whenever money entered conversations. "I appreciate that. But I need you to understand something non-negotiable. I won't become dependent on your income. I won't let Sophie grow up watching her father accept things he didn't earn. I work 2 jobs because I chose to stay out of debt rather than take shortcuts. That matters to me. It matters to me, too. Your refusal to compromise your principles is part of why I fell for you. But there's a difference between taking shortcuts and accepting help from someone who loves you. I'm not asking you to quit your jobs and let me support you. I'm asking you to let me ease the burden enough that you're not exhausted all the time, that you can actually be present for Sophie instead of constantly working." Sophie's laughter carried from the arcade, her voice announcing to strangers that she'd won another round of skee-ball. The sound punctuated their conversation with reminder of what actually mattered, whose well-being took precedence over pride or philosophy. What would easing the burden look like? Daniel kept his tone neutral, buying time to process proposals that simultaneously attracted and repelled him. "Start with the weekend security job. You're working 80 hours between Wilson Industries and the warehouse. That's unsustainable. Let me cover the gap the warehouse fills so you can have weekends with Sophie. Not as charity, as investment in our future together, in you being rested enough to actually enjoy the life we're building. And when people find out? When the gossip becomes that I'm letting my rich girlfriend pay my bills? Then they're wrong about the dynamic and we don't owe them explanations. Daniel, I've spent 3 years not caring what people think about my personal choices. I'm not starting now just because those choices involve you." The logic was sound, the offer generous, but accepting required surrendering ground he'd defended since Angela's death. The warehouse job represented independence, proof that he could provide for Sophie through his own efforts without assistance that came with strings or judgment. Letting Margaret fill that gap meant trusting her in ways he hadn't trusted anyone since discovering that people could weaponize your vulnerability against you. I need to think about it. Not because I don't appreciate the offer, but because changing my financial situation requires more consideration than I can give in a pizza place booth. Fair enough. Just promise you'll actually think about it instead of defaulting to no, because accepting help feels like weakness. I promise. Sophie returned from the arcade with a stuffed dinosaur won from the claw machine, presenting it to Margaret with ceremony that suggested deep significance. "This is Rexy. He protects people from bad dreams. You should keep him at your house so you're not lonely when we're not there." Margaret accepted the dinosaur with solemnity that matched Sophie's presentation. "Thank you, Sophie. I'll keep him safe. And I'm never really lonely anymore because I have you and your dad now. Are you going to be my mom? Like officially with papers and everything?" The question landed with characteristic 6-year-old directness, no social filters or awareness that asking put adults in uncomfortable positions. Daniel started to intervene, but Margaret caught his eye, shaking her head slightly to indicate she'd handle this herself. "That's up to your dad and what feels right for all of us. But I can tell you that I already love you like you're mine. The official papers are just confirmation of what's already true in the ways that matter." "Good. Because I need a mom, and you're the best one I could get." Sophie returned to her arcade games satisfied, while Daniel and Margaret sat with the weight of a child's expectations that exceeded what any adult relationship timeline reasonably supported. 3 weeks together, and his daughter was already planning the family structure, already considering Margaret permanent fixture rather than someone who might leave. "She's getting attached fast." His voice carried concern that wasn't criticism, but acknowledgement of risk they were both taking. "So am I. And so are you, unless I'm completely misreading this situation." "You're not misreading anything. But if this goes wrong, if we don't work out for whatever reason, Sophie's the one who pays the price. That terrifies me more than my own potential heartbreak. Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong. We communicate. We're honest about problems before they become crises. We choose each other deliberately instead of coasting on chemistry and hoping inertia carries us through." The commitment in her voice, the willingness to discuss forever when most relationships at 3 weeks were still negotiating boundaries, should have triggered alarm bells about moving too fast. Instead, it triggered relief that maybe he wasn't alone in feeling like this relationship had always been inevitable, like they'd just been waiting to find each other. Monday morning brought him back to Wilson Industries, where the parking garage video had become company legend, where employees he'd never spoken to greeted him by name with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to barely concealed judgment. The maintenance department celebrated with donuts someone had brought specifically for the occasion, his co-workers offering congratulations mixed with warnings about navigating relationship with the CEO. His supervisor pulled him aside before first break. "Harris, you're officially the most famous maintenance tech in company history. Try not to let it affect your work quality. Won't be a problem. My job performance speaks for itself regardless of who I'm dating. See that it does. And for what it's worth, I think you're good for her. She's been different these past few weeks. More human. People respond better to leaders they can relate to." The observation followed Daniel through his morning rounds. The idea that his relationship with Margaret might actually be strengthening her position rather than undermining it. The board had voted in her favor, but corporate politics never really ended, just shifted into different forms. Ronald Clark hadn't disappeared after losing his vote of no confidence, hadn't stopped looking for angles to exploit. The executive floor felt different when Daniel arrived to replace air filters, the atmosphere charged with tension that hadn't existed last week. Margaret's assistant looked stressed, her usual polish cracking around the edges. Rough morning? Board emergency. Something about quarterly projections not matching expectations. Ms. Wilson's been in there for 2 hours and nobody's happy. She need anything? Coffee or water or 5 minutes to breathe? Best thing you could do is avoid her office until this blows over. Ronald's in there and he's not feeling gracious about last week's vote. Daniel nodded and moved to the adjacent conference room to work, close enough to help if needed but distant enough to maintain professional boundaries. Voices carried through the walls, Ronald's raised in argument while Margaret's remained controlled but sharp. Numbers, stock performance, shareholder value. The vocabulary of corporate warfare where battles were fought with spreadsheets instead of weapons. The door opened 30 minutes later, board members filing out with expressions that suggested nothing had been resolved. Ronald emerged last, pausing when he spotted Daniel changing air filters through the conference room's glass wall. The smile that crossed his face carried malice that made Daniel's instincts spike warning. Harris, right? The maintenance tech who's been all over social media with our CEO. That's me. Something you need? Just wondering how you're enjoying your 15 minutes of fame. Must be quite the upgrade from your usual station. I enjoy my work regardless of what people think about my personal life. Now, if you'll excuse me, these filters won't replace themselves, of course, though you might want to consider how your relationship affects Ms. Wilson's professional standing. Board members talk. Some of us have concerns about judgment and priorities and whether personal entanglements are affecting leadership decisions. The threat wasn't even subtle, delivered with boardroom confidence that assumed power differentials guaranteed compliance. Daniel set down his tools and turned to face Ronald fully, his posture shifting into something that made the older man take involuntary step backward. Let me be clear about something. My relationship with Margaret is nobody's business except ours. If you have concerns about her leadership, bring them up through proper channels with actual evidence instead of using me as proxy for whatever power struggle you're fighting. And if you think intimidating the people she cares about will somehow weaken her position, you're mistaken. It'll just piss her off, and trust me, you don't want her pissed. Ronald's face darkened, but he left without response, his departure leaving Daniel with adrenaline spike and recognition that they'd just escalated tensions that couldn't be de-escalated easily. Margaret appeared 5 minutes later, her expression weary but shifting to concern when she registered Daniel's body language. What happened? Ronald stopped by to remind me that I'm affecting your professional standing. Suggested my presence creates questions about your judgment and priorities. He has no right to talk to you about any of that. I'm going to file a formal complaint. Don't. That's what he wants. He's trying to provoke response he can use as evidence that I'm affecting your decisions, that you're putting personal feelings above professional obligations. We play this smart, not reactive. When did you become an expert in corporate politics? 4 years ago, when I learned what happens when you trust that competence and evidence matter more than office politics and power games. I'm not making that mistake twice. She moved closer, her hand finding his with familiar ease that had developed faster than either of them had planned. I'm sorry you're caught in this. It's not fair. Life rarely is. But we knew this wouldn't be simple. We're managing. Are we, though? Because it feels like every week brings new complications, new ways people try to use our relationship against us. At what point does managing become unsustainable? When one of us decides it's not worth fighting for anymore. Have we reached that point? No. God, no. But I worry about what this costs you. Your peace, your job security, your daughter's sense of stability. Sophie's stability comes from having a father who shows up every day and teaches her that love is worth the risk even when it's complicated. That lesson matters more than shielding her from the reality that sometimes good things require fighting for. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's assistant announcing her next meeting, pulling her back into the executive responsibilities that never paused for personal complications. Daniel returned to his maintenance rounds, the interaction with Ronald replaying in his mind with recognition that this situation would escalate before it resolved. That evening, after picking Sophie up from daycare and navigating dinner and homework, Daniel's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional and clinical, hospital administration calling about outstanding medical bills from Sophie's recent wellness checkup. We show a balance of $847 that's past due. We need to arrange payment or set up a plan before we can schedule her next appointment. I paid that bill in full 6 weeks ago. Check your records again. The administrator put him on hold while Daniel's stomach dropped with familiar dread. the recognition that somehow his financial systems were breaking down in ways he couldn't immediately explain. 4 years of meticulous record-keeping, of never missing payments, of protecting his credit score like armor against future catastrophe, and suddenly there were gaps appearing that shouldn't exist. "Mr. Harris, I'm showing payment was attempted but declined due to insufficient funds. The charge was returned and fees were added to your account." "That's impossible. I had more than enough to cover that payment. According to our records, your bank returned the charge on March 15th citing insufficient funds. You'll need to contact them to resolve the issue." Daniel ended the call and immediately pulled up his banking app, his fingers moving with precision that came from checking balances daily. The account showed $847 deducted on March 15th with notation that the transaction had failed, but his available balance at that time had been over $2,000. Something was wrong with the bank's systems, or his account, or someone had accessed his information and was systematically destroying the financial stability he'd built. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her wind turbine sketches clutched against her chest. "Daddy, you look worried. Is something wrong?" "Just some confusion with the bank, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Are we going to be okay?" The question, delivered with 6-year-old perception that saw through adult reassurances, made his chest constrict with protective instinct that required suppressing his own panic. "We're always okay, baby. I've got us." But after Sophie fell asleep, after he'd spent 2 hours on phone with bank representatives who couldn't explain the discrepancy but promised to investigate, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and felt the first cracks appearing in the foundation he'd built. The warehouse job suddenly felt less like optional income and more like essential buffer, Margaret's offer to cover that gap transforming from generous gesture to potential necessity. He called her at 11 p.m., later than he'd normally risk disturbing her, but needing to voice concerns that were metastasizing into full crisis. "Something's wrong with my bank account. A medical bill I know I paid is showing up as unpaid with insufficient funds notation. The bank can't explain it, but my balance is $300 less than it should be. Could someone have accessed your account, stolen your information? Maybe. Or the bank's systems are malfunctioning. Either way, it's destabilizing everything I've carefully maintained for 4 years. One more incident like this, and I'm back in debt I can't escape. How much do you need?" "Don't. I'm not calling to ask for money. I'm calling because I'm terrified, and you're the only person I trust enough to admit that to." The silence stretched long enough that Daniel wondered if he'd crossed some boundary by revealing vulnerability that exceeded 3 weeks of dating. Then Margaret's voice came through steady and certain, anchoring him when everything felt like it was sliding sideways. "Tomorrow morning you're filing fraud reports with your bank and credit bureaus. Tomorrow afternoon we're sitting down with a financial advisor I trust who can help identify what's happening and how to protect your accounts. And tomorrow evening, regardless of what we discover, you're going to remember that you're not alone in this anymore. You have me. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. I'm just scared of becoming the kind of person who needs saving instead of handling his own problems. Needing help isn't weakness, Daniel. It's being human, and humans do better together than alone." After they hung up, Daniel pulled out Angela's photo and had the conversation that existed only in his head but felt essential anyway. "I'm trying to do this right. Trying to build something with Margaret while honoring what you and I had. Trying to be the father Sophie needs while also being the partner Margaret deserves. But it's hard. Everything feels precarious, like one wrong move and it all comes apart. Tell me I'm not screwing this up." The photo offered its usual silence, Angela's frozen smile providing no guidance except the memory of her voice during those final weeks. "Don't let fear win. That's all I ask. Whatever happens, don't choose fear over love." Tuesday morning brought discoveries that transformed concern into verified crisis. The bank investigation revealed 3 unauthorized transactions over the past 2 weeks, small enough to escape immediate notice, but large enough to destabilize his carefully balanced budget. Someone had his account information and was systematically draining resources in ways designed to look like normal spending. The fraud department promised investigation but couldn't restore funds immediately, couldn't guarantee protection against future unauthorized access, couldn't offer anything except bureaucratic procedures that would take weeks to resolve. Daniel filed reports with police and credit bureaus while Sophie sat in Wilson Industries daycare, oblivious to the financial crisis threatening their stability. Margaret's financial advisor confirmed the fraud patterns and implemented protective measures, new accounts with enhanced security and monitoring systems that caught suspicious activity in real time. But the damage was done. $318 stolen from an account that couldn't absorb that loss without cascading consequences. The warehouse paycheck that would have covered the gap wouldn't arrive for another week, and the medical bill wouldn't wait. "I need to accept your offer." Daniel's voice came out flat, drained of the pride that had made acceptance difficult. "The weekend warehouse job. I need you to cover that gap until I can recover from this fraud situation. Not permanently, just until my accounts are stable again and I can rebuild the buffer." Margaret didn't gloat or point out that she'd offered weeks ago and he should have accepted sooner. She just nodded and transferred funds to his new secure account with efficiency that suggested this represented normal Tuesday business rather than significant relationship milestone. Done. "And Daniel, this isn't charity. It's what partners do. I'll pay you back. There's nothing to pay back. We're building something together and partners share resources. But if it helps you feel better, yes, someday when you're in a position to contribute extra and I need help with something, we'll call it even. Deal?" Deal. The transaction took 30 seconds through her banking app, but represented shift in power dynamics that Daniel felt viscerally. He was now financially dependent on Margaret in ways that hadn't existed before. That made him vulnerable to accusations that he was with her for economic security rather than genuine connection. Ronald would love this development if he found out, would weaponize it immediately as evidence that the maintenance worker was exploiting the naive CEO. That evening, driving home after picking Sophie up from daycare, Daniel's phone buzzed with text from unknown number. "Nice solution to your money problems. Guess dating the boss has perks beyond the obvious. Too bad board members notice when CEOs suddenly start funding their boyfriend's lifestyle. Might affect those votes of confidence." The message was unsigned, but the threat was clear. Someone was watching, documenting, building case against Margaret that would use Daniel's financial crisis as evidence of exploitation. He showed Margaret the text after Sophie fell asleep, watching her face harden into expression he'd never seen before. "That's Ronald. He has someone monitoring our activities, probably the same person who's been spreading gossip through the office. This has gone beyond corporate politics into harassment. What do? We document everything. This text, your fraud reports, the timeline showing your financial crisis started before I transferred any money. We build defense that proves I'm helping you recover from fraud, not funding some elaborate relationship scam. And if that's not enough, if he convinces the board that I'm using you, then I fight harder. But Daniel, I need you to hear this. No matter what Ronald does, no matter what he claims or how he twists the facts, I'm not walking away from you. I'm not letting him use financial manipulation and corporate politics to destroy what we're building. Even if it costs you the CEO position, especially then. Because if I let fear of losing my job dictate my personal life, I've already lost everything that matters." The conviction in her voice, the willingness to sacrifice professional achievement for a relationship that was barely a month old, should have felt premature or performative. Instead, it felt like truth she'd been moving toward since that first elevator rescue, the recognition that some things mattered more than corner offices and quarterly earnings. Wednesday brought escalation in form of emergency board meeting announced via email that morning. Margaret's assistant forwarded the message with notation that this was unusual timing, that emergency meetings required significant justification, that Ronald had clearly manufactured some crisis to force confrontation sooner rather than later. The meeting agenda listed single item: discussion of CEO conduct and fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Margaret spent the morning preparing defense, gathering quarterly reports and employee satisfaction metrics, and every data point that demonstrated her leadership had strengthened rather than weakened the company. Daniel stayed away from executive floor per her request, maintaining professional distance that couldn't be weaponized as evidence of inappropriate workplace behavior. But Sophie had different plans. The call came at 1:15 p.m. from daycare center, the director's voice carrying apologetic tension. "Mr. Harris, Sophie's running a fever of 102. She's asking for you. We need you to pick her up immediately." Daniel left his maintenance rounds without finishing, grabbed his tools and drove to the daycare where Sophie sat in the office looking miserable and small. "Daddy, I don't feel good. My head hurts and my tummy feels weird." He signed her out and carried her to the car, her weight familiar against his chest, while her forehead radiated heat that confirmed the fever wasn't exaggeration. The pediatrician's office could see her in 30 minutes, emergency slot between other appointments. He texted Margaret during the drive. "Sophie's sick. Taking her to doctor. I know your meeting is today. I've got this handled." Her response came immediately. "Do you want me there? I can postpone the meeting." "No. This is exactly what Ronald wants, evidence that I'm affecting your priorities. You handle the board, I'll handle Sophie. We'll talk tonight." The pediatrician's office was crowded with other sick children, the waiting room a symphony of coughs and feverish complaints. Sophie dozed against Daniel's shoulder while he filled out paperwork and tried to suppress anxiety about missing work during Crisis that already had his supervisor questioning his reliability. "Sophie Harris?" The nurse called them back after 45 minutes that felt like hours, her expression professionally sympathetic as she took Sophie's temperature and vital signs. The doctor arrived 10 minutes later, her examination thorough but revealing nothing immediately alarming. "Looks like viral infection. Fever, headache, some nausea. Pretty standard for this time of year. Keep her hydrated, give her children's acetaminophen every 6 hours, and if the fever goes above 103 or she develops other symptoms, bring her back immediately. How long will this last? Usually 3 to 5 days. The fever should break within 48 hours if it's just viral. If it persists longer than that, we'll need to run more tests." Daniel carried Sophie back to the car with prescriptions for fever reducer and anti-nausea medication, his mind calculating missed work hours and childcare complications, and how this illness intersected with Margaret's board meeting timing in ways that felt suspiciously convenient for Ronald's narrative. At home, after settling Sophie on the couch with juice and crackers and her favorite movie, Daniel's phone rang with Margaret's number. The board meeting had lasted 3 hours, her voice conveying exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. "How's Sophie?" "Viral infection, fever and headache. Should resolve in a few days, but she needs monitoring. And you left work to care for her." "Of course I did. She's sick and she's 6 and she needed her dad. Ronald made sure the board knew you left work for personal emergency. He positioned it as example of how your family obligations conflict with your job performance, how dating me creates instability in your life that affects company operations. That's insane. Any parent would leave work to care for sick child. He's not arguing logic. He's building narrative that paints you as liability and me as CEO, who's too personally involved to recognize how your situation affects company image and employee morale." Did it work? The board voted to table discussion pending further review, which means they didn't rule in my favor immediately, which means Ronald successfully planted enough doubt to buy himself time to gather more ammunition. So we're losing. We're fighting. There's a difference. After they hung up, Daniel sat in his living room while Sophie dozed through her movie and tried to calculate how many more complications they could survive before something broke permanently. Financial fraud, illness, board politics, Ronald's harassment, all converging in ways that tested structural integrity of relationship, barely strong enough to handle normal stress. Thursday brought Sophie's fever spiking to 103.2 despite medication, brought emergency return to pediatrician who ordered blood work and looked concerned in ways doctors tried to hide but parents recognized immediately. They were running tests for infections that required antibiotics, for complications that transformed viral illness into something requiring more intervention. Daniel sat in the examination room while they drew Sophie's blood, her brave face crumpling when the needle pierced skin. He held her hand and made promises about ice cream and extra movie time, anything to distract from pain that medical necessity required inflicting. Results would take 24 hours. They sent Sophie home with stronger fever reducer and instructions to monitor for symptoms that would require emergency room visit. Daniel called his supervisor to explain the situation, requesting remaining sick days and unpaid leave if necessary. The response was sympathetic but firm. "We need you back by Monday, or we'll have to discuss your continued employment." Margaret arrived at his apartment that evening with groceries and children's books and determination to help despite Daniel's protests that she had her own crisis to manage. Sophie's face lit up when Margaret walked through the door, her feverish misery temporarily forgotten in excitement of having her favorite person visit their home. "You came." Sophie's voice was hoarse but enthusiastic. "Did you bring Rexy?" "Of course I brought Rexy. He's the best protector against bad dreams and feeling yucky." They settled into evening routine that felt simultaneously natural and surreal, Margaret reading stories while Daniel cooked soup that Sophie might keep down, all three of them navigating illness and crisis with teamwork that shouldn't exist after just a month together but did anyway. After Sophie fell asleep, her fever controlled enough to allow rest, Daniel and Margaret sat at his kitchen table with silence that carried weight of everything unsaid. Finally Margaret spoke, her voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "Ronald's not stopping. He's got someone feeding him information about your financial situation, Sophie's illness, every complication that supports his narrative that you're unstable and I'm too personally compromised to lead effectively. How do we fight someone who has resources and board position and no ethical boundaries? We fight with truth. With evidence that my performance is stronger than ever, that the company is thriving, that his obsession with undermining me is what's actually affecting board focus and shareholder confidence. And if truth isn't enough, then we accept that some battles can't be won through conventional means and start planning what comes after." The resignation in her voice triggered protective instinct that overrode Daniel's careful boundaries about professional territory. "You're not giving up your position because Ronald's a vindictive ass who can't accept that he lost fair vote. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic about outcomes. If the board votes no confidence despite all evidence supporting my leadership, I need backup plan that doesn't leave me destroyed professionally." "What kind of backup plan?" "Transition to chairman role with reduced day-to-day responsibilities. It maintains board seat and strategic input while removing me from operational leadership Ronald's targeting. It's not defeat. It's strategic repositioning. It's letting him win. It's choosing my battles and recognizing that some victories cost more than they're worth." "Daniel, I've spent 3 years proving I belong in that CEO office. I've sacrificed relationships and personal happiness and any semblance of life outside work. And for what? So I can keep fighting board member who will never accept my leadership regardless of performance? For your career. For everything you've built. I'd trade all of it for what we have right now. You and Sophie and actual happiness. That's not weakness. That's finally understanding what success actually means." The conviction in her statement, the willingness to walk away from CEO position she'd fought years to earn, should have felt flattering. Instead, it felt terrifying, the recognition that she was willing to sacrifice too much, that his presence in her life was becoming excuse to abandon professional achievement rather than motivation to fight harder for it. Friday morning brought test results showing Sophie's infection was bacterial rather than viral, requiring antibiotics and close monitoring but not hospitalization. The doctor's reassurance helped but couldn't completely eliminate anxiety that came from Sophie being sick enough to need medication beyond standard fever reducers. Daniel administered the first dose of antibiotics while Sophie complained about the taste, then settled her on the couch with juice and television and instructions not to move without telling him. His phone buzzed with message from Margaret. "Board meeting rescheduled for Monday. Ronald's making his final push. This is it." The timing was brutally strategic. Monday, when Daniel would be returning to work under threat of termination, when Sophie would be recovering but still requiring monitoring, when every stress point in their lives would be active simultaneously. Ronald had orchestrated this convergence deliberately, maximizing chaos in hopes something would break. That evening, after Sophie's fever finally broke and her appetite returned enough to request chicken nuggets for dinner, Daniel's phone rang with call from number showing Sullivan Tech in the caller ID. His entire body went cold with recognition, 4 years of suppressed trauma surfacing in instant visceral response. The voice on the other end was professionally cordial, human resources requesting he contact them regarding outstanding matters from his previous employment. We've been trying to reach you for several weeks about documentation that requires your signature. Can you come to our office Monday morning at 9? What documentation? Personnel files regarding your termination. There are some discrepancies we need to resolve before we can close your file permanently. My termination was 4 years ago. Why is this coming up now? Company policy requires all files be reviewed and verified before permanent archival. Your file has some inconsistencies that need addressing. What kind of inconsistencies? That's something we need to discuss in person. Monday at 9. Can you confirm you'll be there? Daniel ended the call without committing, his hands shaking with recognition that this wasn't coincidence. Someone had contacted Sullivan Tech, had requested they reopen his file, had manufactured this complication to arrive exactly when Margaret's board meeting would be determining her future. The timing was too perfect, the request too strategic. He called Margaret immediately. Ronald's escalating. Someone contacted Sullivan Tech, the company that fired me 4 years ago. They want me to come in Monday morning to discuss discrepancies in my termination file, the same morning as my board meeting, exactly the same time. This isn't coincidence. Ronald's trying to force me to choose between being there for you or dealing with my own professional crisis. So we both handle our own crises and meet afterward to compare notes. Or I skip Sullivan Tech and stand with you at the board meeting. Daniel, you can't ignore Sullivan Tech. If there are actually discrepancies in your termination file, that could affect your ability to get future engineering positions. This might be manipulation, but it's manipulation with real consequences. Same as your board meeting. The difference is, my board meeting determines my professional future at one company. Your Sullivan Tech meeting potentially affects your entire career field. You have to go. The logic was sound but felt like surrender, like Ronald had successfully divided them and forced separation at exactly the moment they needed united front. Daniel's mind raced through contingencies and backup plans, searching for strategy that let him be in 2 places simultaneously. Saturday brought brief respite. Sophie's antibiotics working well enough that her energy returned and her fever stayed controlled. Margaret arrived mid-morning with supplies for helping Sophie practice her science fair presentation, the event now just 2 weeks away and requiring preparation that illness had interrupted. They spent the afternoon in Daniel's apartment parking lot, Sophie presenting her wind turbine project to audience of neighbors, and Margaret while Daniel documented her practice runs with video camera. The ordinary domestic activity felt surreal against backdrop of Monday's approaching crises, like they were playing at normal family life while knowing the performance couldn't last. After Sophie exhausted herself and required nap, despite protests that she wasn't tired, Daniel and Margaret sat on his apartment's small balcony and watched traffic on the street below. The silence between them carried weight that required addressing before Monday arrived and everything potentially fractured. "I'm scared." Margaret's voice was quiet but steady, stating fact rather than seeking reassurance. "Ronald's been building this case for weeks. He's got board members questioning my judgment. Evidence of you leaving work for family emergencies. Documentation of financial assistance I've provided. Timing that makes everything look like I'm too personally compromised to lead effectively. Are you having doubts? About us? About whether this is worth the professional cost?" "No doubts about us. But doubts about whether I've been fair to you, whether pursuing this relationship has created complications in your life that you didn't need or want. You were stable before I knocked on your elevator door. Now you're dealing with fraud and harassment and professional threats that wouldn't exist if you'd never met me. That's not how this works. You didn't create my problems. Ronald created them by being vindictive ass who can't handle that you chose someone he considers beneath you. And even if staying away from you would eliminate complications, I wouldn't make that choice. Some things are worth fighting for regardless of cost. Even if the cost is your job, your financial stability, Sophie's security, especially then. Because teaching Sophie that love requires courage and that protecting yourself from complications means missing out on everything good is lesson I refuse to deliver. She needs to see that sometimes the right choice is hard choice, that building worthwhile things requires fighting through obstacles instead of avoiding them. Margaret leaned against him, her weight familiar despite the brief time they'd been together. Monday determines everything. If the board votes no confidence, despite all evidence supporting my leadership, I become cautionary tale about CEO who let personal life compromise professional judgment. Or you become example of leader who maintained humanity while achieving results, who proved that personal relationships strengthen rather than weaken professional performance. I hope you're right. Because if you're wrong, we're both facing consequences we might not recover from. Then we face them together. That's what partners do. Sunday passed in slow tension, hours crawling toward Monday morning when every crisis would converge simultaneously. Sophie's fever stayed controlled, but her energy remained depleted, her usual enthusiasm dampened by antibiotics and lingering illness. Margaret spent the day preparing for board meeting while Daniel rehearsed what he'd say to Sullivan Tech representatives, neither of them able to fully focus because their attention stayed fractured across multiple fronts. That evening, after Sophie fell asleep clutching Rexy the protective dinosaur, Daniel stood in his kitchen with Angela's photo and acknowledged that tomorrow might change everything. I'm about to walk into the building where they destroyed my career 4 years ago. About to face people who lied about me and watched my life fall apart and felt no accountability for consequences their actions created. And I'm terrified, not of them, but of discovering that I'm still the person who couldn't fight back, who chose presence over vindication and has regretted that choice ever since, even though I'd make it again. The photo offered its usual silence, but in his mind Angela's voice was clear. You're not that person anymore. You're someone who learned from that experience, who built something good from rubble they created, who's fighting now because you have partner worth fighting beside. Go show them who you became. Monday morning arrived with Sophie's fever finally broken, her appetite returning enough to eat actual breakfast instead of just juice and crackers. Daniel dropped her at daycare with detailed instructions for monitoring and promises to pick her up immediately if anything changed. Then he drove toward Sullivan Tech, toward confrontation 4 years delayed, while Margaret prepared for board meeting that would determine whether professional achievement could survive personal happiness. The Sullivan Tech building looked unchanged. Same glass entrance and corporate logo and reception desk where he'd checked in hundreds of times when this place represented his career and future. Walking through those doors felt like entering haunted house, every corner holding memory of person he'd been before everything collapsed. The receptionist directed him to human resources on the 3rd floor, conference room where 2 representatives waited with file folder that somehow contained power to affect his future. Their expressions were professionally neutral, giving no indication whether this meeting represented opportunity or ambush. Mr. Harris, thank you for coming. We've been reviewing termination files as part of company audit and discovered some discrepancies in your case that require clarification. What kind of discrepancies? The HR representative opened the file, spreading documents across the conference table. According to our records, you were terminated for cause based on safety violations related to HVAC system you designed. However, we've located internal emails suggesting those safety reports were falsified by your supervisor at the time, Christopher Taylor, who has since left the company. The words landed like physical impact. 4 years of suppressed vindication crystallizing into moment that felt simultaneously real and impossible. You're saying the reports that got me fired were fake? That Christopher lied about my designs being unsafe? We're saying there's evidence supporting that conclusion. These emails show Christopher communicated with engineering firm that purchased your designs after your termination, designs identical to the ones he claimed were faulty. The timeline suggests he manufactured safety violations to justify your termination and cover his theft of intellectual property. Why are you telling me this now, 4 years later when it can't fix anything that was destroyed? Because company policy requires we correct personnel files before permanent archival. And because if documentation shows you were wrongfully terminated, you may have grounds for legal action against individuals involved, even if statute of limitations protects the company itself. The room tilted slightly, walls contracting, while Daniel processed implications that cascaded through every aspect of his current life. Vindication after 4 years of believing competence hadn't mattered, evidence that he'd been right about theft and corruption, proof that choosing presence over fighting hadn't been cowardice, but strategic retreat against enemies with resources he couldn't match. I need copies of everything. Every email, every document, every piece of evidence that supports wrongful termination and intellectual property theft. We can provide copies for your attorney. But Mr. Harris, you should know that several board members at Sullivan Tech have been contacted recently about your termination. Someone's been asking questions, gathering information. We initiated this audit partially in response to those inquiries. Who was asking questions? We're not at liberty to say. But the inquiries came from law firm representing interests at Wilson Industries. Margaret. She'd been investigating his termination without telling him, building case that he'd been too defeated to pursue 4 years ago, gathering ammunition he could use against people who'd destroyed his career. While he'd been focused on protecting her from Ronald's attacks, she'd been mounting counteroffensive that went back to original source of Daniel's professional trauma. The HR representatives provided copies of documentation, files that transformed from abstract vindication into actual weapons that could be deployed against Christopher Taylor and anyone else involved in 4-year-old conspiracy. Daniel left Sullivan Tech with evidence that proved everything he'd claimed when nobody believed him. Validation that arrived simultaneously too late and exactly on time. His phone showed 11 missed calls from Margaret. The board meeting had started 30 minutes ago. He was supposed to be there, or at least available by phone. Instead, he was 45 minutes away in traffic that wasn't cooperating, clutching documentation that changed everything about his past, but might arrive too late to affect anyone's future. He called Margaret while navigating Atlanta's congested highways. I've got evidence. Sullivan Tech confirmed Christopher falsified safety reports and stole my designs. They've documented everything. That's incredible. But Daniel, Ronald just presented his case to the board. He's got timeline of your financial crisis and my assistance, documentation of you leaving work for family emergencies, evidence that frames you as liability. I'm too compromised to recognize. The board's voting in 30 minutes. I'm coming. I'll be there in 20 minutes if traffic cooperates. Don't. If you show up now, it supports Ronald's narrative that I prioritize you over company business. Handle Sullivan Tech. I'll handle the board. We'll meet after and figure out what comes next. The line went dead before he could argue, leaving Daniel driving toward Wilson Industries while knowing he'd arrived too late to affect the outcome, too late to stand beside Margaret when the vote determined her professional future. All the evidence he'd gathered, all the vindications Sullivan Tech had finally provided, meant nothing if it couldn't help her fight Ronald's coordinated attack. 22 minutes later, he burst into Wilson Industries' executive floor, documentation clutched in his hand and breath coming fast from sprinting through the parking garage. Margaret's assistant looked stricken, her expression conveying that whatever had happened in that boardroom wasn't good news. Where is she? Board voted 10 minutes ago. Ms. Wilson is in her office. And? The assistant's silence communicated everything before words arrived. The vote was 8-6 against her retaining CEO position. She's transitioning to chairman role effective immediately. Daniel moved toward Margaret's office without waiting for permission, pushing through the door to find her standing at the window with back to the entrance. Her posture was rigid, shoulders squared despite what must feel like defeat, the CEO armor still in place even when the position had been stripped away. I'm sorry. His voice came out rough with emotion he couldn't suppress. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry the evidence came too late. She turned, and her expression wasn't defeated or devastated. It was relieved, almost peaceful. They voted me out, Daniel, 8-6. Ronald got what he wanted. And you know what? I feel lighter than I have in years. Like I've been released from obligation that was crushing me without realizing it. You wanted this position. You fought for it. I wanted validation, proof that I deserved to lead regardless of age or gender or whatever other factors people used to discount me. But I've had that validation. The quarterly numbers prove my competence. The employee satisfaction metrics demonstrate my leadership. Losing the CEO title doesn't erase those achievements. Ronald wins. That's what this means. He gets to claim victory, and you get to explain why the board sided with him. He won a battle I'm no longer interested in fighting. The board offered chairman position with strategic oversight and board seat. I maintain influence without operational burden. And more importantly, I maintain time to actually live instead of just work. Daniel crossed the office, pulling her into embrace that she returned with intensity that suggested whatever grief she felt about the vote was complicated by genuine relief. The documentation from Sullivan Tech crinkled between them, evidence that had arrived exactly when it couldn't change today's outcome but might affect tomorrow's possibilities. I have proof that Christopher and Ronald worked together 4 years ago, that Ronald owned Sullivan Tech when Christopher stole my designs, that everything I claimed about conspiracy was true and documented. Margaret pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression shifting from relief to recognition. Ronald's not just board member with vendetta against me. He's person responsible for destroying your career. This isn't about me at all. It's about him eliminating the people who threatened to expose what he did, which means this isn't over. It's just beginning. The documentation spread across Margaret's desk connected Ronald Clark's ownership of Sullivan Tech to Christopher Taylor's theft with precision that transformed conspiracy theory into prosecutable fact. Margaret's fingers traced timelines showing 4-year plan to destroy careers as preparation for hostile takeover of Wilson Industries, pattern so systematic it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Ronald wasn't just trying to undermine my CEO position. Her voice carried recognition that shifted their entire understanding of stakes involved. He's been positioning himself to acquire Wilson Industries since before we met, eliminating anyone who might recognize his tactics or expose his history. Your termination was strategic groundwork. My relationship with you became threat because you represented evidence of his past corruption. Which means Tuesday's shareholder meeting isn't just about my vindication or your restored position. Daniel moved to window overlooking Atlanta. It's about stopping him before he succeeds at takeover he's been planning for years. We need Christopher Taylor's testimony. Without him confirming Ronald ordered the theft and fabrication, we have circumstantial evidence that looks compelling but isn't conclusive enough to guarantee board action. Margaret's investigator located Christopher in Charlotte. Subpoena served Friday morning requiring his presence at Tuesday's shareholder meeting. The legal compulsion didn't guarantee cooperation, just attendance, leaving them uncertain whether he'd corroborate their evidence or deny everything to protect himself and Ronald. Friday afternoon brought Sophie's fever returning despite antibiotics, emergency call from daycare, and rushed pediatrician visit that revealed resistant infection requiring IV treatment. Daniel sat in hospital pediatric wing while Sophie received aggressive medication, Margaret arriving despite his text saying she didn't need to come, present, because partners showed up during crisis regardless of convenience. 4 hours of treatment while they waited for medication to work, Sophie dozing between doses while Daniel maintained vigil that felt simultaneously excessive and essential. The pediatrician's careful optimism suggested they'd caught escalation before it became emergency, but next 48 hours would determine whether current approach was sufficient. That evening, after Sophie finally slept with fever controlled and Rexy clutched protectively, Christopher Taylor appeared at Daniel's apartment unannounced. The audacity of voluntary visit from man who'd destroyed his career triggered anger. Daniel pushed down through conscious effort. "I got the subpoena." Christopher's voice carried desperation barely masked by attempted composure. "I came to ask you not to do this. I have family, mortgage, career that survives on reputation you're about to destroy. You didn't consider my family when you stole my work and fabricated safety violations that eliminated my income while my wife was dying. I was following Ronald's orders. He wanted your designs and was willing to pay, but taking them required removing you first. I didn't invent the plan, just executed what I was told, which makes you complicit rather than innocent." Christopher's desperation gave way to threat. "If you expose everything Tuesday, I'll make sure everyone knows you took money from Margaret to cover debts, that you've been financially dependent on her since you started dating. This whole vindication crusade is really about securing position as her kept man." Margaret emerged from bedroom where she'd been checking Sophie, her expression cold in ways Daniel had never seen. "Mr. Taylor, you just threatened witness in case involving corporate conspiracy. I recorded that threat. Leave now or I'm calling police for witness intimidation. Christopher's composure cracked. You can't prove allegations you're making. It's been 4 years. Documentation gets lost, memories fade, connections become speculation. We have emails. Margaret's certainty made Christopher visibly pale. Your communications with Ronald discussing manufactured safety violations. Larry Young's testimony confirming he witnessed conspiracy. Sullivan Tech's HR documentation showing Ronald's direct involvement. We have everything, Mr. Taylor. Cooperate and negotiate reduced consequences, or fight and guarantee complete professional destruction. What do you want? Tuesday morning you testify truthfully about everything. Confirm Ronald ordered theft and fabrication. Provide acquisition details. Acknowledge conspiracy and your role. In exchange, employment law violations rather than criminal fraud charges. Christopher left without committing, his departure leaving them uncertain whether Tuesday would bring cooperation or denial that undermined their entire case. Monday morning brought Sophie's follow-up showing continued improvement, fever controlled and infection responding to treatment. The pediatrician's cautious optimism upgraded to genuine relief, examination revealing no concerning developments requiring additional intervention. She's turning corner. Keep antibiotics through full course, but I'm confident we've caught this before crisis. She's strong, Daniel. The reassurance helped, but couldn't eliminate anxiety that had been running high since first fever spike. Daniel took Sophie to school for partial day while Margaret finalized presentation materials, documents organized with precision demonstrating why she'd been effective CEO regardless of board politics. By evening, they'd refined testimony into something comprehensive and devastating, timeline connecting Ronald Sullivan Tech ownership to Christopher's theft to current attacks on Margaret with clarity making conspiracy undeniable. Larry Young would corroborate details. Christopher's presence would allow direct questioning. Margaret's corporate records would demonstrate coordinated strategy for eliminating obstacles to hostile takeover. Tuesday morning arrived with Sophie's fever completely controlled. Daniel dropped her at school with promises to pick her up early for celebration regardless of outcomes, teaching that some victories were defined by courage to show up rather than guaranteed results. Wilson Industries shareholder meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., conference center accommodating 60 people already filling when Daniel and Margaret arrived at 9:30. Shareholders mixed with board members and media representatives creating atmosphere charged with anticipation. Ronald sat at head table with expression combining confidence and contempt, posture suggesting he believed confrontation would end with Daniel and Margaret discredited. Christopher Taylor arrived at 9:40, presence confirming cooperation over resistance, but expression suggesting reluctant choice. Larry Young sat in audience with wife beside him, retired engineer's presence representing delayed conscience manifesting as public testimony. The meeting began with standard shareholder business before controversial items could be addressed. Ronald tried removing Daniel's agenda item through parliamentary procedure, motion rejected by board chairman tired of manipulation tactics. The floor recognizes Daniel Harris to present evidence regarding board member conduct. Daniel moved to podium with documentation representing 4 years of suppressed vindication. His voice was steady, channeling nervous energy into focused delivery making technical complexity accessible. 4 years ago, I was mechanical engineer at Sullivan Tech, designing HVAC systems worth $8 million in potential revenue. 3 months after submitting designs, I was fired based on fabricated safety violations and watched my work appear at competitor under Christopher Taylor's name. I was blacklisted industry-wide and forced into maintenance work to support dying wife and young daughter. The room was silent. 60 people focused on man who'd been invisible and was now commanding attention through competence and documented evidence. What I didn't know was my termination was a strategic move orchestrated by Ronald Clark, who owned Sullivan Tech and planned hostile acquisition of Wilson Industries. My designs represented intellectual property he wanted to control, but taking them required removing me first. Christopher Taylor was his instrument. Fabricated reports were his method. My career destruction was his desired outcome. Daniel advanced slides showing emails between Ronald and Christopher explicitly discussing manufactured termination grounds while protecting intellectual property theft. Larry Young testified next, confirming he'd witnessed conspiracy and stayed silent from fear. Christopher Taylor followed, testimony grudging but accurate, confirming Ronald's direct involvement in systematic conspiracy nature. Evidence accumulated into mountain that couldn't be dismissed. Timeline connecting Sullivan Tech events to Ronald's recent attacks on Margaret, demonstrating pattern rather than isolated incidents. Ronald's expression shifted from confident to panicked as each piece eliminated possible defenses. The room erupted with shareholder questions demanding Ronald's explanation, board members seeking clarification, media recognizing headline story. Ronald attempted positioning everything as misunderstanding and competitive business practices, defense crumbling under documented communications, showing clear intent. Board chairman called emergency executive session, removing Ronald while remaining members discussed response to evidence implicating sitting member in multi-year conspiracy. Shareholders traded speculation and outrage, consensus forming that Ronald's removal was minimum acceptable response. 90 minutes later, board reconvened with decision feeling simultaneously inevitable and insufficient. Ronald Clark removed from board effective immediately, conduct inconsistent with fiduciary duties. Investigation launched into Sullivan Tech practices, findings forwarded to authorities for potential legal action. Christopher Taylor would face employment law review and professional sanctions. Daniel Harris offered Director of Engineering position at Wilson Industries with salary reflecting 4 years lost advancement and formal apology for circumstances forcing maintenance work. Recognition that no compensation could restore what was taken, but represented commitment to making amends. Margaret stood as board completed announcements. I want to thank the board for appropriate action regarding Mr. Clark. However, I'm announcing my resignation as chairman effective today. I'm leaving Wilson Industries to start nonprofit supporting wrongfully terminated professionals, providing legal resources and financial support for people fighting corporate corruption. This experience taught me some battles are worth fighting outside traditional structures where power dynamics favor those willing to abuse positions. The announcement created surprise ripple through attendees expecting Margaret to leverage Ronald's removal into restored CEO position. But Daniel understood completely, recognized evolution rather than retreat, transformation of personal trauma into systemic solution preventing future victims. After meeting concluded, Daniel and Margaret stood in parking garage where relationship had begun. Everything had changed, professional positions and future directions, and understanding of what mattered when external validation was stripped away. We did it. Margaret's voice carried exhaustion and relief. We exposed Ronald, prevented additional career destruction, proved fighting back sometimes works. And now we build something better. Daniel's response acknowledged victory while focusing on future Second Chances Engineering Fund, representing opportunity helping others avoid experiences that nearly destroyed him. Together. Margaret emphasized word that had become promise and plan. Whatever comes next, we build together. Wednesday brought Daniel's first day as Director of Engineering, office on executive floor with windows and space feeling surreal after years in maintenance rooms. His team of 6 engineers had heard about testimony and Ronald's removal, curious about director who'd spent years fixing air conditioners before reclaiming engineering credentials. Morning consumed by meetings establishing priorities, Daniel's technical competence evident enough to quickly establish credibility regardless of unconventional path back to professional position. Lunch brought Margaret visiting with takeout from their pizza place, gesture signaling to co-workers their relationship continued despite eliminated power differential. Thursday brought house hunting with Sophie providing commentary on each property's suitability based on criteria including room size for projects and backyard space for potential dog and proximity to ice cream shops. Third house won Sophie's immediate approval, 4-bedroom colonial with office space and yard meeting arbitrary requirements. This is the one. Sophie's declaration carried certainty, making adults laugh. This house feels happy. Like people who lived here were happy and left some happiness behind for us. By evening they'd made offer, number stretching discussed budget, but feeling appropriate for space accommodating blended family and 2 home-based businesses. Sellers accepted within hours. They'd move in 6 weeks, timeline compressing already accelerated progression, but feeling right despite speed. Friday brought Sophie's science fair award ceremony, blue ribbon presentation making her glow with pride. Daniel and Margaret sat together in audience, presence noted by parents who'd heard through gossip about CEO and maintenance worker romance becoming corporate scandal and ultimate vindication story. After assembly, Sophie's teacher requested conference developing into significant conversation. Sophie's been asking questions about family structure lately, trying to understand what it means that Margaret is part of your lives but isn't technically her mother yet. She's working through blended family concepts and relationship formalization. I wanted you aware of her processing so you could address questions she might not be asking directly. That evening, after Sophie slept with blue ribbon pinned above her bed, Daniel raised topic with Margaret while reviewing nonprofit incorporation documents. Sophie's asking when you become officially her mother. Teacher says she's processing family structure concepts. Margaret set aside legal documents with expressions suggesting she'd anticipated this conversation. What do you want to tell her? I want to tell her it's complicated, that adults need time before making commitments permanent. But that's rationalization, not addressing her need for clarity about whether you're staying or might leave. I'm staying. Margaret's response was immediate and certain. I'm not interested in temporary or conditional. I'm interested in permanent and committed. If Sophie needs legal documentation to feel secure I'm not going anywhere, we figure out what that looks like and make it happen. You're talking about marriage. I'm talking about commitment matching what we're already building. We're buying house together, starting nonprofit together, raising Sophie together. Only thing missing is formal recognition of family structure already existing in every meaningful sense. We've known each other 6 weeks. People make permanent commitments all time based on less evidence than we have. We've navigated financial crisis and medical emergency and corporate conspiracy, coming through stronger rather than fractured. Most couples don't face that stress until years into relationship. We've stress-tested faster than normal timeline, but with results demonstrating strength rather than fragility. Okay. His capitulation surprised himself as much as Margaret. Let's tell Sophie we're making it official, that you're becoming her mom legally and permanently. Margaret's smile transformed her face into joy expression. When? Soon. After we move into house, after nonprofit is established. But soon. Before Sophie's 7th birthday in August, so she starts new school year with clarified family structure. Timeline gave them 3 months to formalize commitments, enough time feeling deliberate rather than reactive, but not so much Sophie's questions would persist unanswered indefinitely. They told her Saturday morning over pancakes, Sophie's reaction combining expected enthusiasm with unexpected wisdom. Does this mean Angela is still my mom too? Sophie's question cut through celebration to reach avoided territory. Because I don't want to forget her or replace her. I want both moms, the one who was and the one who is. Margaret answered, voice steady with conviction, respecting complexity Sophie identified. Angela will always be your mom. She gave you life and loved you completely, and made your dad the person he is now. I'm not replacing her. I'm adding to love you already have, building on foundation she created. You don't have to choose between us. You get both, memory of her and presence of me. Answer satisfied Sophie completely. Her 6-year-old logic accepting complexity adults struggled navigating. 6 months later, standing in backyard of house Sophie had declared happy, Daniel watched family and friends gather for wedding formalizing commitments already proven through crisis. Sophie stood beside Margaret wearing purple dress and holding butterfly release basket, her role as flower girl and wise child and family bridge all represented in single moment. Larry Young attended with wife, retired engineer finding redemption through Second Chances Fund volunteering. Daniel's former maintenance co-worker sat alongside engineering team he now directed, physical representation of journey from hidden competence to recognized capability. Ceremony was brief and personal, vows acknowledging unconventional timeline and accelerated progression, promising partnership through complications rather than pretending those wouldn't exist. When officiant pronounced them married, Sophie released butterflies spiraling upward into Atlanta afternoon, purple wings catching sunlight, while 6-year-old explained that Mommy Angela was watching from heaven and was happy Daddy and Mom Margaret found each other. Reception featured barbecue and informal conversation, celebration matching relationship personality, rather than conforming to traditional expectations. Daniel stood with Margaret while Sophie demonstrated latest wind turbine prototype to guests. "This is life we chose." Margaret's voice carried contentment transcending professional achievement. "Not the life careers dictated or others expected, but life we deliberately built together starting from elevator malfunction. Not ending," Daniel corrected with smile. "Starting here. Everything before was preparation for what comes next." What comes next? More wind turbines, more engineers we help through Second Chances Fund, more moments watching Sophie grow surrounded by people who chose to show up. Normal life, boring life, happy life, not requiring corporate drama to feel meaningful. Vision was modest compared to CEO ambitions, success measured in family dinners, and nonprofit impact and daughter's science projects rather than quarterly earnings. But standing in backyard watching Sophie teach butterfly biology to guests while fireflies emerged with dusk, Daniel recognized modest vision represented everything that actually mattered. His phone buzzed with text from Wilson Industries' new CEO. Ronald Clark just reached plea agreement on fraud charges. 3 years probation, restitution to victims, permanent ban from corporate board positions. Justice finally caught up. News should have felt more satisfying. Vindication complete with legal consequences. Instead, it felt like final chapter closing on story already moved past need for that resolution. They'd built something better than revenge, something helping future victims rather than just punishing past perpetrators. Daniel showed Margaret the text. "We won." Her voice carried acknowledgement without triumph. Not just board fight or legal case, but larger battle about whether fighting back was worth cost. We proved it was, and now we prove building something positive matters more than defeating negative forces. They returned to celebration where Sophie conducted science demonstration for growing audience, explanation of renewable energy principles delivered with enthusiasm, making PhDs listen respectfully. This was their victory, family built deliberately, and community formed through authenticity, life measured in moments mattering rather than achievements impressing. Evening concluded with Sophie falling asleep on Daniel's shoulder while fireflies danced and guests departed with promises to visit. Margaret and Daniel carried sleeping daughter inside, tucking her into bed in room already feeling like hers. Standing in doorway watching Sophie sleep with Rexy and Angela's photo on nightstand beside Margaret's first gift, Daniel felt full weight of what they'd built. Not perfect family or ideal circumstances, but real partnership forged through complexity and strengthened by choosing each other repeatedly when easier options existed. Margaret's hand found his. No regrets? Not one. Every hard choice, every crisis we survived, every time we chose each other over safety brought us here. I'd do it all again exactly the same way. Even the part where you fought corporate conspiracy while daughter was sick and I was losing CEO position? Especially that part. Because that's when we proved this was real, that we were partners who fought together rather than individuals happening to date during crisis. They stood in Sophie's doorway while their daughter slept peacefully, two people who'd found each other through malfunction and built something functioning better than either could have managed alone. Outside, Atlanta continued its perpetual hum. Inside, their family rested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges they'd face together, partnership tested and proven capable of surviving whatever came next. Because that's what partners did. They showed up. They fought when fighting mattered. They built something better when fighting wasn't enough. And they chose each other, repeatedly and deliberately, until choosing became reflex stronger than any individual instinct for self-preservation. This was love. Not romantic fantasy version, but complicated, exhausting, entirely worthwhile reality of two people becoming family through conscious decision rather than just emotional chemistry. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything that actually mattered when success was measured by what you built rather than what you accumulated.